Subcommittee on the Constitution will come to order. Welcome everyone here today. And I want to thank my colleague, particularly Senator Wyden, who has so much insight and wisdom on the topic that we're addressing today, and my colleagues who will be joining us, most especially Senator Cruz, the ranking member today. I have some opening remarks before we go to Senator Wyden. In the wake of the tragic shooting just within days, we're gathered here today in the wake of the spate of mass shootings across the country over the last week, most notably racist violence in Buffalo. My heart breaks for Buffalo and the East Side communities visited just yesterday by the president, victimized by this white supremacist terrorism, and to all communities that have been shattered by gun violence. Make no mistake, it is domestic terrorism and extremist violence that we witness. The country saw it firsthand, and we should honor the survivors, victims, and their families with action. Honor with action to stop this relentless carnage. As dark, ugly, and hate-filled as this time seems, we cannot back down or give up. Replacement theory has become the go-to hate mantra for domestic terrorists, bolstered by a gloss of legitimacy that is conferred by the right-wing media ecosystem and by supposedly mainstream Republicans who not only refuse to condemn it, but actually engage in dog whistle endorsement of it. Unless and until Republican leaders unequivocally denounce replacement theory and take action to combat this threat, we will continue to see this kind of violence in our country. There are no, quote, very fine, end quote, people on one side of this issue, and even my silent colleagues are complicit in the resulting violence and in allowing this twisted hate ideology to fester and spread in our democracy. Last year, this subcommittee held 3 hearings on stopping gun violence. These hearings covered extreme risk protective orders, ghost guns, and safe storage laws. This afternoon, we've come together to discuss the need to protect domestic violence survivors from gun violence and the Lori Jackson Nicolette Elias Domestic Violence Survivor Protection Act. Obviously, this hearing was scheduled way ahead of the most recent gun violence, but I'm hoping that all of the shootings that we have seen, including Sandy Hook, will prompt some action on areas where we can develop some consensus, bipartisan consensus, as well as consensus among everybody along the spectrum of different opinions that people may have on this issue. This legislation is named for Lori Jackson. We'll hear her story from her sister this afternoon, Casey. 8 years ago, Lori was shot and killed by her estranged husband in Oxford, Connecticut. She was 32 years old, mother of 2. The month before she was murdered, Lori obtained a temporary restraining order against her husband and fled to her childhood home. The order was set to expire on May 7th, the day before Lori was scheduled to go to court and seek a permanent restraining order. But early that morning, her estranged husband found her, shot her 4 times, and then turned the gun on her mother, Mary, who survived, and she is with us today. I first met his family literally within days of that tragedy when Mary still had her arm in a sling with bandages from that absolutely horrendous moment in their lives. This legislation is named for Nicolette Elias, who was shot and killed by her abusive ex-husband after he refused to surrender firearms pursuant to a restraining order. and Senator Wyden will share Nicolette's story today. Our bill would help protect survivors at the moment their abusers are most dangerous, when survivors leave abusive relationships and seek help from law enforcement and the courts. That is the moment of highest rage and lowest protection. It would ensure that abusers subject to temporary restraining orders cannot purchase or possess firearms. It would also close the boyfriend and stalking loopholes, which Senator Klobuchar has been a long-standing leader in seeking to address. And it would create a grant program to help states implement policies and procedures to keep firearms out of the hands of domestic abusers. The facts on domestic violence are absolutely harrowing. More than 600 women in the United States every year are shot to death by intimate partners. Firearms are used to commit more than half of all intimate partner homicides in the United States. The mere presence of a firearm in the home increases the likelihood that domestic violence will escalate into a homicide by fivefold. Domestic violence victims are 5 times more likely to die in a home with a firearm. In March, Congress, on an overwhelmingly bipartisan basis, I'm proud to say, passed and President Biden signed into law the Violence Against Women Authorization Act. I've been a staunch and steadfast advocate of VAWA, and I am glad that it was passed and signed into law, but there's a lot more that we can and must do on domestic violence, and we can follow the leadership that we've seen at the state level, including Connecticut. 23 states and the District of Columbia have already closed the ex parte loophole, at least in part. In Texas, for example, it's unlawful for any person other than a peace officer who is subject to a protective order, including temporary ex parte orders, to possess a firearm. Though the exact procedures and standards may vary, these state laws incorporate strong due process protections, protecting due process rights, and are no more subject to abuse than any other legal process. There's a reason these states have all acted. These laws work. States that have closed the ex parte loophole, like Texas, have experienced a 13% drop in intimate partner homicides and a 16% drop in these homicides perpetuated by firearms. These are not just abstract statistics. These are real lives, saved every single day in our great country. I hope we'll come together and build on this bipartisan work that we did to reauthorize VAWA and pass this legislation too. Domestic violence is a horrific scourge across the country. It's every day in real lives for hundreds, eventually thousands of women. And domestic violence is made deadly, certainly more deadly, when firearms are involved. We have an opportunity to do something about it. We must act. I hope we can take steps through this hearing to provide more protection. I will turn to my colleague, the ranking member, Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses who are here today. The kind of stories that we're discussing today are horrific. And when it comes to crimes of violence, we face far too many crimes of violence in all 50 states. Like many members of this committee, I have spent a lot of years working in law enforcement, working to punish, working to incarcerate violent criminals, and working to deter violent crime before it occurs. If the objective is to stop violent crime, what is effective is targeting actual violent criminals. Unfortunately, the pattern we've seen from our Democratic colleagues is that inevitably when a shooting occurs, such as the horrific, bigoted, racist shooting in Buffalo, which all of us are horrified by, Democrats can't help but follow then White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel's adage of never let a good crisis go to waste. And they immediately do what Chuck Schumer has done, what the chairman just did, saying the cause of this horrific and racist mass murder is wonderfully and conveniently the opposing political party. That's cynical, it's dishonest, and it's wrong. And in this instance, the facts of this particular deranged shooter don't even fit the story they're trying to tell. Yes, he was a racist and a bigot and an anti-Semite, all of which are repulsive. But he was also a leftist. He was also an environmental extremist who talked about that if we don't stop consumption in this world, that humanity is going to die off. And yet somehow I don't see my Democratic colleagues saying their intemperate advocacy of the Green New Deal caused this psychopath to murder people. He's also someone who has condemned conservatism and capitalism. He hates capitalism. He's a leftist. And yet I don't see my Democratic colleagues saying, well, all the socialists in the Democratic Party are the cause of this lunatic, racist mass murderer. If the objective is to stop violent crime, and that should be the objective, we should focus on policies that work. Consistently, the policies that work are policies that target violent criminals. Now, 10 years ago, I introduced legislation, the Grassley Cruz legislation, designed to go after felons and fugitives and those with serious mental illness when they lie and try to illegally buy a gun, to prosecute them and put them in jail. To ensure that our databases are complete, in Texas, we've seen far too many of these mass shootings, including the horrific crime in Sutherland Springs. I was there at that beautiful church the day after that shooting. In that instance, that mass murderer should have been in jail. But the Obama administration failed to report his felony conviction in the Air Force to the database. So when he went to purchase his firearm, the background check came up clean. Had Grassley Cruz passed into law, it mandated the Department of Justice conduct an audit of federal crimes to make sure those convictions are in the database. Presumably that audit would have caught that felony conviction. Not only that, Grassley Cruz also created a gun crime task force to prosecute felons who try to illegally buy firearms, which means that deranged mass murderer would have been in prison, incarcerated, instead of in that beautiful church murdering those innocent people. We had a vote on the Senate floor on Grassley Cruz. It got a majority of senators voted for it. 52 senators voted for it. That was in the Harry Reid Democrat Senate, a majority Democrat Senate. Now, you might think, okay, a bipartisan majority, surely this passed. Well, no. Turns out Senate Democrats filibustered Grassley Cruz. They demanded 60 votes. And my Democratic colleagues who are here today all voted for the filibuster to stop Grassley Cruz from going into effect. Why was that deranged shooter not in jail? Because the approach of today's Senate Democrats is to try to go after the firearms of law-abiding citizens instead of targeting the violent criminals that are the real threat. Now, domestic violence is a horrific scourge. Far too many women, children, and even some men are victims of domestic violence. But yet, when it comes to firearms, yes, are used by violent criminals, but they are also used over and over and over again by victims of violent crimes to defend themselves. If any of us could pass a law to end domestic violence in America, we would happily and enthusiastically do so. I have, over the course of the past 2 decades, dealt with far too many families who have lost loved ones to violent crime, homicide. It is horrific, it is evil. But disarming people in situations where they themselves are potentially at risk risks increasing the chances of violence. If you have an individual that may be a victim of domestic violence, preventing that individual from defending herself or himself is a uniquely bad idea. Chairman referenced that the states adopt laws to address these issues, and I think that is the right approach. Unsurprisingly, the people of the state of Texas make different decisions about how to handle these issues than perhaps the people of Connecticut or California or New York. That's how our constitutional system was meant to operate. And so, I wish we had a hearing focused on how to stop violent crime. I wish we had a hearing focused on the skyrocketing murder rates in this country that we're seeing right now. I wish we had a hearing focused on the skyrocketing carjacking rates that we're seeing in this country right now. I wish we had a hearing focused on the policies advocated by congressional Democrats of abolishing the police and defunding the police that caused the crime to skyrocket. I wish we had a hearing on Soros DAs that were elected with millions of dollars from Democratic donors who get into office and refuse to prosecute violent criminals, release violent criminals onto the street, and then allow those violent criminals to commit yet more murders. That would be a hearing with some urgency. That would be a hearing where we are seeing people being killed over and over and over again, but that hearing does not fit the political agenda of my Democratic colleagues. Thank you.
We're going to hear from Senator Wyden. There are rebuttals to what you just heard, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move to my colleague from Oregon, Senator Wyden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, let me just note that for years, you have been working for justice as an attorney general here in the Senate. I very much appreciate your leadership. And I think by way of just summing up in a sentence, and I'd like my full remarks to go into the record, and I'll just kind of summarize. What our bill is talking about is not taking away gun rights for law-abiding citizens. It's about closing a dangerous loophole that has put at risk American families and tragedies in Oregon and Connecticut and around the land. And I want to tell the committee briefly about Nicolette Elias. Nikki, she was called, Portlander. She worked for a number of years at Portland State University, a tremendous mom, a protective mom, 2 young daughters. On November 10th, 2014, she was murdered by an abusive ex-husband. She was shot, colleagues, in front of her children. In front of her children. And when she was killed, Nicolette's ex-husband was under a temporary emergency restraining order. Now, Nikki did everything possible to protect herself and her daughters. She reported that he had been physically and sexually abusive, that he handled guns out in front of the children. He left her threatening messages in the months before she was killed. She was fearful enough, Mr. Chairman, of what he might do that she worked out emergency safety plans with friends and neighbors. Now, the key point, despite the restraining order, there was no legal requirement to separate Nicolette's ex-husband from his guns. And what happened, as we know, in Oregon, Connecticut, and elsewhere, was a monumental tragedy. On that Monday morning in November, he took a gun to Nicolette's house in Southwest Portland, shot her 7 times. Then he took his daughters, 7 and 8 years old, to her home. Just imagine that. Just imagine that. Shoots the mom, takes the daughters to his home. When police arrived later, he walked into the backyard and took his life. Mr. Chairman, colleagues, nobody should have to endure what Nicolette's family has endured. I wish I could tell the committee that few people know what they've been through, but the reality is, as the chairman knows, there are a lot of people around the United States who know exactly what this is all about. Each year in the country, more than 600 women are shot to death by an intimate partner. 600 women. And Senator Blumenthal, the chairman, and I believe that Congress has a moral obligation to do something about it. Should have eliminated the loopholes that leave women in the crosshairs of violent spouses and partners with guns a long time ago. So as the chairman noted, we have a Lori Jackson, Nicolette Elias Domestic Violence Survivor Protection Act. We get at the dangerous loopholes. Dangerous loopholes. And what we're talking about, I say to my colleague from Texas, is not going to take away gun rights for law-abiding citizens. In fact, what we're talking about is backed by the majority of gun owners. When it came to trying to protect her kids and herself, Nicolette did everything right. She used all the tools. She went through the court system. She presented evidence, told her story. She did her part. And, Mr. Chairman and colleagues, her government failed her. So what the chairman and I are talking about is closing those loopholes. If Congress had passed the bill the chairman and I are talking about prior to November 2014, Nicolette might still be here today raising her teenage daughters. Last point I'm going to make, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your indulging me. It's been said that the gun safety debate was over when the Congress basically did nothing after these tragedies in response to Sandy Hook. And as you know, we've had tragedies in my home state. We live in southeast Portland, tragedies close to our house. The chairman and I just don't buy the idea that things were over when nobody did anything in response to the Sandy Hook massacre, and we're going to fight relentlessly against the hate that the chairman very appropriately described drove Buffalo based on the facts we have. Every man, woman, and child in America ought to be able to feel safe at home, at work, at school. Passing our legislation, in my view, I close with this, ought to be something that's beyond red and blue, beyond partisanship. We ought to do it because it's the right thing to do. Chairman, thank you for having me. I've got full remarks. If I could put them in the record, that would be great.
Thanks, Senator Wyden. Your full remarks will be in the record, but I just want to say while you're here that I really appreciate your advocacy. Like you, I refuse to accept that Congress is going to be complicit and, again, do nothing. I think there are areas where we can agree. We may agree to disagree on other areas with our colleagues. I'm very, very hopeful that this time will be different, and really appreciate the advocacy that you have provided on this bill. Thank you very much for being here. I'm going to introduce our witnesses, and we really appreciate all of you being here. I want to say how grateful I am, particularly for the Connecticut witnesses, both Casey Mason and Holly Sullivan making the trip to be here. Casey, with your family. Casey is the sister of Lori Jackson. The legislature that we've come together to consider this afternoon is named in part for Lori, who was shot and killed by her estranged husband in 2014. After her sister's murder, Casey became a very powerful and eloquent advocate and has worked on closing that loophole in federal law and at the state level as well. And she's here with her parents and her daughter. Holly Sullivan is the president of Connecticut Citizens Defense League, CCDL, which is comprised of 43,000 members dedicated to protecting the right to keep and bear arms. Ms. Sullivan also serves on the advisory board of the DC Project, a national organization for women for gun rights. She's also a select person in the town of Southbury in Connecticut, and we really appreciate her making the trip as well. Rob Valenti is a policy consultant for the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence with expertise in firearms, federal domestic violence laws and interventions, and tribal domestic violence issues. Previously, she was the assistant director of the Family Violence Department in the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. She served as attorney advisor to the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women and was the founding director of the American Bar Association Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence. She holds a PhD from Cornell and a JD from George Washington School of Law. We have a custom in our committee that we swear in all witnesses, so I'd ask you all to stand and I'll administer the oath. Do you swear that the testimony that you're about to give is the whole truth, nothing but the truth, and that you will swear to it, so help you God? Thank you all. We'll have opening statements and begin with you, Casey. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Casey Mason, and I am here on behalf of my family and my sister, Lori Jackson. Lori had this deep, loud, deep voice and the most contagious laugh. When she laughed, you just had to laugh along with her. She was incredibly shy until you got to know her. Once she was comfortable with you, she showed her true silly self and never stopped talking. She had a big heart and would do anything for her family and friends. I'm already starting. She loved to travel, and we were lucky enough to travel to some amazing places together. I apologize. That was one of the things I loved most about her. I could always convince her to go on an adventure with me. Life changed for us when she met her husband, and I began to worry that my sister was being abused. The sister who I could always laugh with and be silly with was no longer present. She was physically there, but she was a shell of the person she once was. He was constantly by her side, never letting her talk to anyone alone. The more I got to know him, the more I became aware of his controlling ways, and the more I feared for my sister's safety. On April 1st, 2014, after a heated argument where she was pushed to the ground, Lori decided she had had enough, and she decided it was time to leave the marriage. It was the happiest day of my life because it was the day I got my sister back. But it quickly turned into a nightmare as her estranged husband began to harass not only Lori, but my entire family. We spent the next month living in fear of where and when her estranged husband would appear, and fear of what he was capable of. Every time we left the house, we were constantly vigilant of our surroundings. We scanned the parking lots for his car before getting out of ours. We then scanned the parking lot again before leaving the store to go back to our cars. She had a buddy system in place at her work, and I had his picture hanging at the security desk at my school so he wasn't accidentally let into the building. We spent the whole entire month hiding, looking over our shoulders, and with the constant lingering fear that he was going to come back. Lori did everything in her power to keep herself and her children safe. She was in contact immediately with the police department. She was advised to file for a restraining order. So she filed and was granted a temporary restraining order the day after she left her husband. Her first restraining order expired before her estranged husband could be found and served. So Lori filed again and was granted a second temporary restraining order. On May 7th, 2014, the day before the hearing to make Lori's temporary restraining order permanent, her estranged husband broke into my parents' home where Lori was staying. He shot and killed her. Lori was 32 years old. Lori knew her estranged husband owned a gun. At that time in Connecticut, he was under his legal rights to keep it. I am proud to say that loophole has been closed in Connecticut, but Connecticut's law alone would not have been enough to save her. The gun that he used was not the gun he already owned when he killed her. Her estranged husband went to Virginia, where he legally purchased a new gun. This is why it is so important to have this law on a federal level. This way, abusers cannot evade the law by purchasing their guns in another state. The bill named after my sister would have made a difference. It would have saved her life. It's too late for Lori, but this law can and will make a difference in another family's story. Thank you for your time and the opportunity to share my story with you.
Thank you so much. Ms. Valente?
Good afternoon, Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Cruz, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Roberta Valente. I am a lawyer, and I have worked for more than 30 years on legal and policy issues relating to domestic violence. I currently serve as policy advisor to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. National Coalition Against Domestic Violence is America's oldest national grassroots domestic violence organization. We are dedicated to supporting survivors and holding offenders accountable and supporting advocates. We envision a national culture in which we are all safe, free from domestic violence. At NCADV, we define domestic violence, also known as intimate partner violence, as intimidation, physical assault, battery, sexual assault, and/or other abusive behavior as part of a pattern of power and control perpetrated by one intimate partner against another. Domestic abusers regularly use firearms as a tool with which to exert power and coercive control. A shocking 13.6% of women and 5.9% of men in the United States experience non-fatal intimate partner firearms abuse in their lifetimes, which includes non-fatal shooting, pistol whipping, and other non-fatal violence. A survey of callers by the National Domestic Violence Hotline found that 67% of respondents whose abusers owned firearms believed their abuser partners were capable of killing them. 60% of intimate partner femicides are committed using firearms. Domestic violence assaults involving a firearm are 12 times more likely to result in death than assaults using other weapons or bodily force. In fact, firearms violence is typically the most extreme when survivors attempt to leave the abuser or seek help from the justice system, such as petitioning a court for protection or reporting abuse to law enforcement. Between 2010 and 2017, intimate partner homicides committed with firearms increased 26%. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated this trend. In Indiana, intimate partner fatalities increased an astounding 181% between July 1st, 2020 and June 30th, 2021, compared to the previous year, with a percentage committed using firearms increasing from 67% to 98%. In Ohio, intimate partner violence fatalities increased 62% between July 2019 and June 2021. Texas saw a 22% increase in 2021 over 2019. A survey of domestic violence programs early in the pandemic found that 50% of respondents reported that abusers threatening to shoot survivors had become more of a problem, and that 33% reported an increase in intimate partner homicides in their communities. The bill under review today by the subcommittee, S-2169, the Lori Jackson Nicolette Elias Domestic Violence Survivor Protection Act, would make significant progress in reducing firearms fatalities in domestic violence cases. Federal firearms law provides partial protection for survivors of domestic violence whose abusers have or are threatening them with escalating firearms violence, but we have some significant gaps. Survivors who have never married, cohabitated, or had a child in common with their abusers, in other words, dating partners, are not protected. Abusers subject to qualifying final protection orders or convicted of misdemeanor, domestic violence, or felony violence may not purchase, possess, or transfer firearms under federal law, but abusers subject to emergency protective orders face no similar prohibition. Persons convicted of misdemeanor stalking are not subject to the federal firearms prohibition. Non-intimate partner stalkers are not subject to the federal firearms ban, even though research shows that stalking behavior, whether targeting an intimate partner, acquaintance, or stranger, is highly predictive of future homicide attempts. We know that local justice systems struggle to develop effective responses that protect survivors from abusers' firearms violence. They need federal funding to ensure that abusers found by courts to be extremely dangerous cannot possess or purchase firearms. This act would close these lethal loopholes in federal law, as well as provide funding to support local efforts to reduce the impacts from the lethal intersection between domestic violence and firearms. And it includes time-tested mechanisms to protect due process. We urge you to support the passage of S-2169, a comprehensive and well-crafted bill that, if made into law, will finally protect all survivors of the crimes of dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking from threatened or actual firearms violence. Thank you, and I have some appendices to submit to the record.
We'll put them in the record without objection.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Sullivan.
Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Cruz, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Holly Sullivan, and I humbly thank you for this opportunity to speak here today. It is truly an honor. I also want to thank the other witnesses for their views and extend my most sincere sympathies to Ms. Mason. I serve on the advisory board of the DC Project, a national organization of women committed to protecting the Second Amendment through education, not legislation. I am also extremely proud to be the president of the Connecticut Citizens Defense League, a 43,000-member nonpartisan organization committed to upholding the rights of all citizens to keep and bear arms. I also serve as a selectman in my hometown of Southbury, Connecticut. However, above all, I am a single mother to an incredible 8-year-old daughter. Southbury is located directly between Newtown and Oxford, the home of Lori Jackson, and my community is no stranger to tragedy. There are altering days in life when you realize that nothing will ever be the same. December 14th, 2012 was one of those days. I, like many of my neighbors, gathered that evening in Sandy Hook to leave stuffed animals and candles for 26 lives lost. I also vividly recall the day of the inexcusable killing of Lori Jackson. I was a young mother of a 7-month-old baby girl. I remember the sirens and the wave of concern among locals that there was a 6-hour manhunt underway, and it took me right back to 2012. However, my path is a little different from some of the women you might expect to hear from on a bill like this. I was raised with an education in gun safety and firearm awareness that I never fully appreciated the importance of until I had something greater than myself to defend, my own child. It's not easy going against the grain of a more popular narrative. I have been shunned from moms groups and received my share of angry anonymous letters in the mail. However, I cannot sit quietly knowing there is critical information to be shared. There is a balance to be achieved where victims of violent crime can find peace and security while law-abiding gun owners are not unduly stripped of their means of defense and due process rights. However, the bill before you today is not the solution. On behalf of more than 43,000 people, I'm here to testify to you today one absolute truth. Nothing in S-2169 would have prevented the murder of Lori Jackson. Lori's estranged husband purchased a handgun in Virginia, transported it back to Connecticut, which is already prohibited by federal law. He had complete disregard for the law, and I believe he was determined to commit the act regardless. I know with absolute confidence that this bill will not result in the desired outcome, and I testify before you today as we have lived under this very law in my home state for the past 5 years. The bill does not, in any way, address the circumstances of the horrific killing of Lori Jackson. It is critical that women struggling in domestic situations understand where this bill falls short on protecting them. Like much well-meaning legislation, this law, compounded with other onerous ones, has created unintended consequences in Connecticut. We now have 3 vehicles by which an individual can seek remedy in a violent situation. He or she can simply call the police to report a concern, they can file a risk warrant, or they can petition for an ex parte restraining order. It is confusing, complicated, and incredibly expensive. Gun owners are largely excluded from the discussion on how to remedy an issue that we are actually the subject matter experts on. 2/3 of all gun-related deaths are suicide, yet in Connecticut, the very people who have access to firearms generally have no seat at the table to discuss policy that impacts them directly. Recent legislation leaves the very community of individuals with access to firearms uncomfortable seeking help for fear of erroneous red flag complaints with no meaningful penalty for perjury. Our reality is that individuals who have not been charged with any crime are subject to confiscation without being afforded due process. Further, groups like Hold My Guns doing outstanding life-saving work cannot be effective in our state due to onerous transfer laws. Connecticut laws may be some of the strictest in the country, but they are far from a gold standard we should aspire to as a nation. Connecticut focuses so much on doing something every year that the legislature finds a solution in need of a problem as often as a problem in need of a solution. Last year, Connecticut saw a surge of 40,000 new gun owners, and women are undeniably the fastest growing demographic of gun owners, and Connecticut is no exception. In fact, African American women in Connecticut had the greatest increase in new permit issuance compared to any other demographic. I am not here to tell you that every woman needs to carry a gun. I am here to tell you that no woman should be denied her ability to defend her life. The means by which she is comfortable doing so is her personal choice. I am also here to speak on behalf of women who are alive today because they exercise their right to defend themselves with a firearm but are missing in this discussion. As survivors of their own tragic encounters, they live, breathe, and walk among us because they were armed. There are no community gatherings to celebrate their survival or even offers of thoughts and prayers. In fact, they are often vilified for being a gun owner in the first place. They are forgotten because they survived. And in conclusion, I ask you to reconsider the bill before you. I ask you to be honest with those praying for relief from abuse in regards to what this bill can and cannot do. And above all, I ask you not to create a national policy where we sacrifice the very individual freedoms we hold dear to be compromised. I ask for an effort to hold violent criminals accountable, to offer meaningful remedies for victims, and to never forget that above all else, we have a right to exist granted to us by our Creator, not our government. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Sullivan. I just want to assure you we're going to make every effort to hold violent criminals accountable. Most of my career was involved in law enforcement. I am in favor of law-abiding citizens, including, or maybe most especially, women, having those rights enforced. Second Amendment is the law of the land. And we're not having a hearing on defunding the police because I'm against defunding the police. I am in favor of providing more resources that would provide for both public safety and justice. We're not going to have a hearing on lax prosecutors because I am against lax prosecution, as is demonstrated by my record as United States Attorney, Chief Federal Prosecutor, as well as Attorney General. So I appreciate a number of the points that you have made, and we are having this hearing to consider many of the points that you have made, but also the rights of victims and survivors to be protected. If we can do better in protecting them through a law that eliminates loopholes or gaps in that protection, we're going to do it. Thank you for being here today. Let me turn to Casey Mason. You've just heard the argument that nothing would have prevented your sister's death. I feel that this law might well have done so. And there's no knowing with certainty all of what might have happened and what might have been done. But tell me what you feel and how you react to that statement.
I obviously disagree. I think that it would have made a difference. But yeah, I don't really know what else to say. I'm like a little emotional right now.
Thank you. Ms. Valenti, perhaps you could respond.
Yes, I'd be happy to. I think that this bill would have made an enormous difference. The most dangerous time, as you mentioned earlier, Senator, is when someone leaves a domestic violence situation. And during that time, they often reach out for a temporary protection order, an emergency protection order, whatever it's called. This is injunctive relief that's offered for a temporary period of time until a full hearing can be scheduled. If that time period also includes relinquishing firearms on the part of an abuser who has shown themselves to be violent, this is absolutely the right thing to do. Most temporary protection orders last for 14 days at most. And during that time period, the court is balancing findings of fact that show extreme violence against whether or not someone losing possession, not ownership, but possession of their firearms for 14 days would be a hardship. That would have made an incredible difference. That would have stopped him in his tracks. And I feel heartbroken to think that this law has not yet become federal law.
I am heartbroken too, and I appreciate the courage and strength of his family in coming forward and providing a face and a voice for a tragic loss that might well have been avoided. Let me ask you, Ms. Valente, in reviewing this legislation and also in your experience, do these laws, including the one before us now, proposed, provide due process rights? That is, an opportunity to be heard before anybody separates that person from a firearm?
It does protect due process. And this law was actually written with a very important language in there that has already been time-tested and has already been litigated. It's language from the Full Faith and Credit Act, which is also something that came from VAWA in 1994. And that requires the enforcement of temporary protection orders. And what it says is, when a temporary order is issued, upon service of that order on the respondent and notice an opportunity to be heard being scheduled within a reasonable time period, due process is afforded. Case law stands absolutely clear on this. Injunctive relief is temporary. It is done to avoid irreparable harm. There is no more irreparable harm than the loss of a life.
Thank you. We're going to have 5-minute rounds of questioning, and just so the witnesses know, we have a vote that's ongoing right now, so we may be taking a recess. I hope not, because a number of my colleagues are here and they can take the gavel while I go vote. So we'll do our questions in tandem. I'm going to turn to the ranking member. We'll probably have another round of questioning. I have additional questions, but in the interests of my colleagues, I'll turn to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I would note on the question of violent crimes, and in particular violent homicides, that we are seeing increasing all across the country at a horrifying level. But just a moment ago, the chairman said that he opposes defunding the police and abolishing the police. And that is the stated view of most, if not all, of the Senate Democrats, particularly right now as we have an election coming up in November. But the interesting thing about serving in the Senate is that talk can be cheap, and you actually have votes on the record. So last year, when President Joe Biden nominated one of the leading advocates of abolishing the police in the country, a woman named Vanita Gupta, to the number 3 position at the U.S. Department of Justice, the chairman of this committee and every Democrat on the committee had an opportunity to state their views and to cast a vote. Every single Democrat in the United States Senate voted to confirm one of the leading advocates in the country of abolishing the police. President Biden then gave Democrats a second opportunity to take a view on this topic when he nominated Kristen Clark to a senior position in the U.S. Department of Justice. Once again, every single Democrat in the United States Senate voted to confirm Kristen Clark. So now Democrats have voted to confirm 2 of the leading advocates of abolishing the police and defunding the police in the country. The chairman says he doesn't support Soros DAs that refuse to prosecute violent crime, that let violent criminals go. Well, again, facts are stubborn things. One of those Soros DAs was a prosecutor named Rachel Rollins, who in Suffolk, Massachusetts, put out a list of 15 crimes, many of which were violent, that she would not allow her prosecutors to prosecute. President Biden nominated Ms. Rollins to be the United States Attorney for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And at this point, you know where this ends. Every single Democrat in the entire Senate voted to confirm Ms. Rollins, a Soros prosecutor who would not prosecute a significant number of violent criminals, to be the U.S. Attorney. Actions have consequences. When it comes to firearms, our Democratic colleagues are eager to target law-abiding citizens, and yet they consistently diminish or refuse to acknowledge defensive use of firearms that preserve people's lives. I read from you a 2013 executive order, and in fact the report that was published pursuant to that executive order, from the White House of President Barack Obama, hardly a right-wing source. According to the Obama White House, and I am quoting here, quote, defensive use of guns by crime victims is a common occurrence, although the exact number remains disputed. Almost all national survey estimates indicate that defensive gun uses by victims are at least as common as offensive uses by criminals, with estimates of annual uses ranging from about 500,000 to more than 3 million. In other words, what the Obama White House told America is that up to 3 million times a year, an American uses a firearm in a defensive capacity, in a capacity to prevent a violent crime, in a capacity to protect themselves, in a capacity to protect their children. And yet, in all of these discussions, those defensive uses of firearms to keep people safe, to keep people alive, are consistently disregarded. I would note also that we have testimony that was submitted by Amy Swearer from the Heritage Foundation, which I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into the record. So ordered. This document details 272 innocent people who were facing potentially domestic violence, whose lives were saved by the use of a firearm, including 48 minor children. And it goes through example after example after example. Now, Ms. Sullivan, you said in your written testimony, and just a moment ago in your oral testimony, that women are one of the fastest growing demographics of new gun owners in America and in your home state of Connecticut. Can you tell this committee why you believe that's the case, and what are the potential benefits of that development?
Yeah, absolutely. In Connecticut, it is truly incredible to see the number of women who have a new mindset to say that they will not be a victim. And the reality is our state feels more unsafe than I've ever known it to be. I've had individuals come up my driveway that don't belong there, and we are truly seeing a new state of things in Connecticut where it is very unsafe, and women are flocking to the range. Classes are filling up where they are understanding as empowered feminist women that they have the ability to defend themselves. And one of the things that's often overlooked is if there is a larger offender, there are very few things that a woman can use to truly defend herself the way she can with a firearm, a knife, a bat. None of those things really give her the ability to have equal force. And it's very important that we're clear that this is about defensive use. This is not offensive use. And women are understanding and realizing that they have the ability to protect their own lives with this tool.
Thank you. That was very powerful.
Thank you, Senator. I believe it's my turn. Ms. Mason, I understand you became involved in gun violence prevention efforts following the tragic death of your sister, Lori. I want to thank you for your work and for your bravery in speaking out about this issue with us today. Actually, your story is all too familiar. The fact of the disturbing loopholes that exist in our country's gun laws is one of the reasons. An individual can obtain a firearm even if they are under a temporary restraining order or have been convicted of domestic violence against a dating partner, believe it or not. This is a failure on the part of the Congress to do our job and protect survivors of domestic violence. And I hope your testimony here today will be seen for all three of you, heard widely, and enable us to change things to a better state. So why is it important, since new members have come in, to extend gun prohibitions to people under temporary protection orders and not just permanent protection orders? And in addition to closing these dangerous loopholes, how else can we help support survivors of domestic violence? I will begin with you and then quickly go right down the line.
Well, I would say in my case, my sister was under two temporary restraining orders, and her estranged husband was legally able to purchase the gun that he used to kill her. So, you know, if this law was in effect, that wouldn't have been able to happen because he did legally purchase the gun. So it would have made a difference.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. I think there is a comprehensive package of things that need to happen, and many of them are in this bill. One of the important ones is a grant program to help communities develop better responses so that when police are contacted about dangerous situations, they know exactly how to respond. When an abuser is ordered to relinquish firearms according to the law, that because they've been adjudicated as being found to be violent and an abuser, that those firearms are taken, that they are stored, because in the case of a temporary order, they may be returned following a full hearing. So I think that this grant program is a very, very important piece of this, in addition to closing the loopholes that it's attempting to close.
Thank you. Ms. Sullivan?
So for me, when I think about this, I think one of the things that stands out the most...
Could you speak directly into the mic?
My apologies.
Thank you.
I think it's important to acknowledge that the only individuals who follow the law are people who are fearful of the repercussions and those who actually care about if they are violating the law. And when we talk about these things and we talk about that they cannot possess firearms, well, they may not possess firearms, but they sure could, because they don't honor or respect the law or the legislation. And I think that is a distinguishing factor that needs to be made between somebody who may not have a firearm, but if they're a criminal and they're intent on doing harm, they sure can. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Cruz? Oh, excuse me, I made a mistake. It was just pointed out to me by ever alert staff. Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks very much. Let me particularly welcome Ms. Valenti here, who has been working to reduce domestic violence for a long time. Indeed, we owe you a hearty thank you for the work you did with then Senator Joe Biden to get the original Violence Against Women Act signed into law in 1994. I'm pleased that we were able to renew that accomplishment with a reauthorization 28 years later. Just foundationally, could you give us a quick overview about that process and what the passage of VAWA meant for women in America?
It was a huge change. Domestic violence had been considered a private family matter. And we began to see cases appear in the media that really started to illustrate that this is a problem for the whole community. And it's a danger and it's a drain on the resources of a whole community. The Violence Against Women Act, that as it was formulated back in 1994, was a comprehensive effort to work with law enforcement, courts, prosecutors, victim advocates, and survivors to come together with excellent local solutions. It started a whole wave of coordinated efforts to respond to domestic violence. I have to tell you that the view of domestic violence by prosecutors, courts, and law enforcement is so different from when I first began doing my work as a victim advocate. It has had a huge impact.
How well established in the science and research is the character of domestic abuse and violence as escalatory?
It's very well researched. And as a matter of fact, I had asked earlier for permission to include some additional information, which I've submitted, which are a number of research articles that will help explain that. But we do know that it's escalatory. We do know...
So it would be prudent to base public policy based on that established...
published, peer-reviewed research that has been going on for decades.
You've pointed out that access to a firearm by a male abuser increases the risk of intimate partner murder by 1,000%.
That is drawn on actual information that we have. This is data that we know. These are police reports. These are convictions. This is information that has been pulled together and statistically analyzed. We know this.
So there's a factual predicate to take action once the escalatory incidence of domestic abuse begins in a relationship.
Yes.
And try to eliminate that or reduce that 1,000% greater likelihood of a murder by restricting the known abuser's access to a firearm, correct?
That's correct. And what we do know in the states where these laws have passed, there is, and again, you'll see that in the testimony the written testimony that has been submitted by the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the appendices, that in states where this has been adopted, the homicide rate has dropped because it is preventive. I think that is an excellent way to describe it.
Indeed, in the 23 states, including my home state of Rhode Island, that have ex parte orders that prohibit gun ownership, there's been a 13% decrease across 23 states in intimate partner homicides, which, because there are so many of them, 13% times that ends up being a lot of actual lives that have been saved. Let me, as my time runs out, just respond to something that the ranking member said about Ms. Vanita Gupta and Ms. Kristen Clark, that they were both leading advocates of, quote, abolishing the police. I just want the record to reflect that the organization Fact Check looked at that precise allegation and did a very lengthy review, and here is their final word at the end of their review, that Vanita Gupta and Kristen Clark, quote, did not call for abolishing the police, and neither did every single Democratic member of the Senate. So with that, let me turn the hearing over to Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse, and thank you to the panel for joining us today. Grateful for your testimony, and my heart goes out to you for what your family's been through. A case in Georgia, a woman named Janet Paulsen, shot 6 times by her husband after a temporary restraining order had been issued. She survived. She said afterwards that seeking protection, she'd gone to local law enforcement after the TRO had been issued, asking them for counsel on how to defend herself. And the officer held up the TRO, put a pen through it to demonstrate a bullet hole, and advised her to purchase a firearm to protect herself. Now, the question before us is whether women should be protected from spouses and intimate partners who pose a direct threat to their safety, whom a judge has found poses a direct threat to their safety and issued a restraining order. Ms. Valente, based upon your personal experience and expertise, can you comment on how such a policy would or would not save the lives of Americans whose partners pose a direct threat to their lives where a TRO has been issued?
I think it would make a great difference. I have to tell you that when we see, and when the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence collects information about all the domestic violence homicides that occur each year. We have a project called Remember My Name, where we remember those who were killed. And I have to tell you, when we look at the facts of the case, so many of them are related to a temporary protection order because everyone says there's nothing you can do about firearms at that time. There are better mechanisms in place because the law actually addresses final protective orders. So in that case, it looks different. They may have developed a system for having the police go back, or the sheriff go back with the respondent and pick up the firearms, and also inform them that they cannot purchase any others, having compliance reviews, having them check in with parole or probation officers. All of these are wonderful pieces that work, and the grant program in here can help make that work. But until we pass this law, until this law happens, we don't have that opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Valente. And I want to clarify, the officer in Cobb County, Georgia, was doing a service to Ms. Paulsen, warning her that the TRO did not protect her.
It does not protect her unless the law stands behind enforcement, and that's what this is about.
Ms. Mason, based upon your personal experience, your advocacy, your analysis, can you weigh in on the same question, please?
I can just speak from my own experience, and my sister was under a temporary restraining order, and he did legally purchase a gun, which is what he used to kill her. So in our case, it would have made a difference if he wasn't allowed to legally purchase that gun.
Ms. Mason, so sorry for your loss. Thank you for your courage and commitment in joining us today. And Ms. Sullivan, ask you to respond to the same question, please. I know you may have a different view.
Yeah, I do have a different view, and I would agree with that officer that the restraining order is only worth the piece of paper that it's written on, and there are a lot of women that feel that way, and I think and we know this, is that when women get their permits and lawfully carry for the first time, they are citing defensive and home defense and personal defense as their reason for doing so. So I think that it's important to recognize that there are only so many officers present, right? They can't stand at our doors and they can't be everywhere that we are. So for many American women and women in my state, they feel that it is their own responsibility.
So, Ms. Sullivan, just for clarity, and the officer was warning Ms. Paulsen in this case that the TRO did not protect her because the law did not forbid her husband, who posed a direct threat to her life and health, from purchasing a firearm. Is it your position that a spouse or domestic partner or intimate partner who's had a TRO issued against them by a judge because of the violent threat that they pose to their partner's life or health should nevertheless be permitted by law legally to purchase a firearm? Is that your position?
Well, I think when we're talking about the restraining order itself, I think it's important to clarify that that is just a document. When it comes to this law and my position on this law, I think it is important to recognize that temporary restraining orders can and have been used to disarm women as well.
I'm so sorry, Ms. Sullivan, but I'm already over time, and I want to make sure that we have you on the record clearly on this issue. And it's a yes or no question. Is it your position that a spouse or a domestic partner or an intimate partner against whom a temporary restraining order has been issued by a judge because of the threat they pose to the life or health or safety of their partner should nevertheless be permitted by law legally to purchase a firearm? It's a yes or no question.
Until they've had a hearing and it's been determined they should be able to lawfully purchase a firearm.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan.
Thank you. I think my colleagues have asked all their questions on our side, so we're going to do a second round of questions. And forgive me if I am repeating ground that they have covered. Let me ask you, Ms. Valente, is there anything in this bill that takes guns away from women?
There is not unless the woman has been adjudicated by a court as either a misdemeanant, a felon, or someone subject to a protection order.
So a woman who buys a gun for self-defense, who is law-abiding and not threatening domestic abuse in a way that a court would adjudicate a real and present threat, would have no fear of losing a firearm, correct?
That is correct. And we do hear from women who would like to arm themselves. Our recommendation at the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence is that studies do show that it is, as you quoted earlier, the mere presence of a firearm in the house poses a danger. It doesn't matter who owns the firearm. During a domestic abuse incident, research shows that the abuser is quite likely to take control of the firearm, and so then put the survivor at risk. So those who want to do that, though, because they are familiar with firearms and do wish to use firearms, we recommend highly that they get training constantly. We know that law enforcement trains every month with their firearms, yet we know that different national organizations that study police activity have told us that only 40% of gunfire that law enforcement officers fire actually reaches the intended place. So we know that even if you're practicing every month, something bad could happen otherwise. We believe that the best thing is for all firearms to be out of the house until the courts and the law have dealt with the domestic violence.
And that's your recommendation based on prudent and wise practices, but a woman who disagrees with you, or a man for that matter, threatened with domestic violence could buy a firearm under this law. Nothing would preclude it.
Nothing would preclude it.
There was a mention of the Grassley Cruz proposal, and just to tell you a little bit about it, and then I'll ask you a couple of questions. The Grassley Cruz proposal creates a number of new federal offenses for trafficking in straw purchases, but it would only prohibit straw purchases if prosecutors can prove the purchaser knew that the recipient was prohibited from buying a gun or knew that the person intended the gun for a crime. Pretty difficult to know. It would only prohibit trafficking if the prosecutors could prove that the trafficker knew that the recipient of the firearm was prohibited. This proposal actually weakens the law, as you can tell from your knowledge of the current law, because it imposes heightened knowledge requirements that are more difficult for prosecutors to meet and eliminates the ability of prosecutors to go after those who lie on federal firearms about their intent to purchase firearms for another person. There are actually stronger bipartisan proposals, like the Leahy-Collins-Durbin Stop the Illegal Trafficking in Firearms Act, that would help address these problems. The Grassley-Cruz proposal also makes it harder for ATF to do its job and easier for dealers to sell handguns across state line. It imposes constraints on ATF enforcement. It actually erases from the NICS background check system the names of individuals determined to be mentally incompetent following an administrative proceeding when the VA submits that information to the government authorities. These measures undermining enforcement seem to really weaken the law because enforcement is so important. All the great laws on the books are dead letter if they're not consistently, conscientiously, and competently enforced. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I think that that's one of the wonderful things about this bill, the grant program within it, which would absolutely address that need for improving enforcement. And we're very, very happy to see that in there.
In fact, far from, as my colleague from Texas suggests, defunding law enforcement, this bill actually bolsters law enforcement with more resources, correct?
It would, based on the community-based response, which would involve law enforcement, courts, victim advocates, probation, parole. All of those are important pieces in putting together a strong enforcement response. But law enforcement, of course, is key to that.
I'm going to ask one more question, then turn to my colleague, Senator Klobuchar, for her statement and questions. She's going to join us remotely. But let me ask you, Ms. Mason, in your opinion, would this kind of law bolster your trust in the system if you were in your sister's place years ago? And has the Connecticut law, in your view, added public safety to survivors and victims of domestic violence?
I think it would have, definitely made my sister feel more comfortable. I mean, she went to the police. She told them how much she feared for her safety. We just weren't sure what he was capable of. But I think that having this would have been another layer of protection for her and, maybe more of peace of mind that there was something more behind this than just that temporary restraining order, that, he couldn't go and purchase another weapon, that he couldn't keep the ones he did have. So it definitely, I think, adds another layer that we need.
Thank you. I don't know whether...
I'm here.
Great. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Senator Blumenthal. Thanks for your leadership and for putting together this really important hearing. As you know, both Senator Blumenthal and I have been supporting each other and leading bills in this area for years. I have the bill to prevent abusive dating partners and convicted stalkers from buying a gun. Provisions of that bill were actually included in the House bill to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act, for which 29 Republicans voted for it. But when the bill came to the Senate, we were unable to get the Republican votes, honestly, to include it in the final bill. And that was more than disappointing, but the rest of the provisions in the bill were very, very important. And we have not, by one iota, given up on these bills. And I guess I'd start with you, Ms. Mason. I want to thank you for your courage in coming forward, telling your story, your sister's story. As someone from a family that has experienced domestic violence, could you talk about how important it is that addressing gun violence should be part of the federal government's efforts to help victims? And I know how hard it is to tell your own stories, but I would believe that a lot of the motivation for you in telling the story is to make sure it doesn't happen to other people again. Go ahead, Ms. Mason.
Yeah, I always say that I tell my story because I never want another sister in my shoes because it's life-changing. So I just think having this bill and having another layer of protection for someone when we know under a temporary restraining order, those 2 weeks, everything is very heated still. It's an unstable time, you know, when a marriage is ending or when there's violence and there's a need to get the restraining order. It's such a crazy time for those 2 weeks. So I just think having another layer of protection would just be so beneficial and can save lives.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Ms. Valente, in 2014, this is how long we've been trying to pass these bills, the Judiciary Committee, under Senator Grassley's and Leahy's leadership, held a hearing on my bill, and one of the Republican witnesses was a sheriff from Racine, Wisconsin, who was a self-described conservative Republican, but he testified actually in favor of closing this loopholes. And he said this: dangerous boyfriends can be just as scary as dangerous husbands. They hit just as hard and they fire their guns with the same deadly force. In fact, we know that approximately half of intimate partner homicides in the U.S. are committed by dating partners. Can you say more about the connection that we've seen between gun violence and domestic violence? And we know 33 states have taken action, and how those changes helped in this regard.
Yes, thank you. Research has shown in the states where they have taken these steps and changed the law in this manner, that there has been a reduction in homicides. Again, I've submitted some of those studies in the materials that we handed in yesterday, and we encourage you to look at them. They really back this up, knowing that over time, since the passage of the first Violence Against Women Act, when more domestic violence cases involved married or formerly married couples, and now where more people who seek protection orders are in dating relationships that are not covered by this, it's really important that the Violence Against Women Act provisions are updated and the firearms provisions are updated. As a matter of fact, for the rest of the Violence Against Women Act, dating violence has been added. It's been added since 2006.
Exactly.
Yes, and so...
Yet this critical piece of it, it hasn't been. And I still remember back in 2014 at that hearing, all the Republican witnesses actually agreed, not on the whole bill, but they agreed on the dating partner piece of it. And so that's why this has been so frustrating. One last question. In your testimony, you point out that 20% of intimate partner homicide victims are someone other than the intimate partner: children, other family members, law enforcement responders, bystanders. I still remember a horrible case in Lake City, Minnesota, where a police officer who had just been with his family for the Christmas nativity show with the 3 children. He responds to a domestic violence scene, shot in the head, killed. And next time he's in church after the nativity play, is as a victim of homicide at his own funeral with his family walking down that aisle. I was there, I won't forget that. But the other thing that people don't always think about, in addition to the statistic you put forward, is also that kids that witness domestic violence often end up in the system themselves because they grow up with this kind of violence. I had outside of my office when I was DA a picture that showed a woman holding a baby with a Band-Aid over the baby's nose, and it said, the woman had a Band-Aid over her nose, but she's holding the baby, and it said, "Beat your wife and it's your kid that will go to jail," to make that point. Do you want to comment on those two things, the problem with children in a home witnessing violence, and then also the fact that other people are often killed by domestic violence perpetrators?
Yes, there's a lot of information that can back this up. A lot of law enforcement organizations have tracked this, and we can get that information to you if you like. It is a very high percentage of law enforcement who are subjected to, accompanying damage when an abuser is behaving in the way that, in a violent way with a firearm. There are people who, neighbors have been caught up in this, friends. Somebody will leave, and a survivor will leave and stay in someone's house, and that person is at risk. Parents, as you've heard, are at risk when they offer shelter to their children. And as for children, witnessing this, watching that terrorism has a terrible generational effect. I also want to point out that in one of the things that we look for when we worry about lethality is we ask, has he threatened to kill the children too? Because these threats, I'll kill you with this firearm, are often extended to the children in the household as well.
Right. Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks very much, Senator Klobuchar. I just want to point out that Senator Klobuchar's bill, and I really want to thank her for her leadership on it, is known as the Protecting Domestic Violence and Stalking Victims Act, which would close the boyfriend and stalking loopholes. These loopholes continue to exist in many states. 32 states and the District of Columbia have taken steps to close the boyfriend loophole, but the stalking loophole refers to a gap also in the existing definition of misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, and it has been closed in only 10 states. So this is a measure that is really important, and I want to thank Senator Klobuchar for her leadership. On the point that has been made about firearms affecting children, just a few statistics. Data drawn from 16 states indicates that 2/3 of child fatalities relating to domestic violence were caused by guns. 2/3 of the fatalities to children, who are often the victims of domestic violence, were caused by guns. Nearly 31% of gun homicides of children under the age of 13 are related to domestic violence. So this is a scourge that is deadly for children, made all the more so by the presence of a gun in the home. And just to put all of what has been said today in some context, the pandemic has raised levels of domestic violence markedly, perhaps as a result of the stress and anxiety that has been caused by COVID, perhaps because people are confined in a space, perhaps because seeking escape from abuse is more difficult. Whatever the reason, the pandemic has made abuse and violence more likely. Would you agree, Ms. Valenti?
Yes, we are seeing that, and we know that there are researchers out there who are working on that to absolutely quantify those figures that our victim advocates see and are reporting anecdotally.
So there are numbers that support this contention that the pandemic has increased both the frequency and the depth of domestic violence. And just to finish, domestic violence, I think we can all agree, regardless of what we think about gun violence prevention, is a scourge that must be stopped, and it is a cycle, as has been mentioned. It's a cycle that is, in effect, learned from experience. The children who witness it in their homes are more likely to repeat it. The perpetrators of domestic violence, I think it's 70+%, somewhere between 70 and 80%, have seen or experienced it in their own homes. So this is a cycle that is born of experience. And breaking that cycle means somehow intervening to stop it. As Attorney General of the state of Connecticut, I started an organization called Men Make a Difference, Men Against Domestic Violence, which enlisted men to provide role models, to educate and do outreach to boys and show them that there's no condoning domestic violence. And these role models, prominent figures in entertainment and sports and broadcasting have done great work. And the co-sponsor of this effort, Interval House, our largest domestic violence shelter in the state of Connecticut, has been absolutely instrumental and inspiring in the work that it has done to educate and outreach to men and boys. So I thank you all for being here today. It means a lot that you have come, particularly our witnesses from Connecticut. I know that not easy to do, but we really appreciate your coming today, both Ms. Sullivan and Ms. Mason. Ms. Valenti, thank you for sharing your expertise. I don't know whether my colleague has any closing remarks or questions, but if not, this record will be open for 2 weeks. Any of my colleagues who have questions can submit them in writing, and the hearing is adjourned.